Life has a way of surprising us, even in the most unexpected and darkest of times. In today's story, we'll take you on a journey of courage, strength, and the importance of standing up for what's right. It's about a mother's intuition, the bond between friends, and the power of uncovering hidden truths. Sometimes, it's the quietest moments that reveal the most. Join us as we share this powerful story of survival and new beginnings. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story with life stories. It was early autumn in Rochester, Minnesota, when the crisp air first signaled that fall was approaching. The maple leaves, which were once a vibrant green, had started to turn shades of red, creating a breathtaking canvas outside our window. The mornings were chilly, and the evenings even colder. In the midst of this seasonal change, my thoughts were entirely consumed by a decision I had not been able to stop thinking about. My daughter, Emma, was going to stay over at her friend Lily Harris' house for the weekend. I had always been protective of Emma, but this time, the unease that simmered within me felt different. Maybe it was because this would be her first time staying at someone else's house without us there. Maybe it was because I had recently noticed a subtle change in Lily's family. On the surface, they appeared perfect. Lily's father, Jack, was a well-respected pediatrician in the community. His gentle demeanor and intellectual appearance had earned him the trust of many parents. His wife, Laura, was a stay-at-home mother who was involved in local volunteer activities. And their home, a beautiful colonial-style house, was a model of suburban perfection. Yet, something about their household always made me uneasy. I couldn't pinpoint the exact reason, but there was an air of tension whenever Jack and Laura were around. Laura always wore long-sleeved clothes, regardless of the season, and she seemed unnaturally tense whenever Jack was near. It wasn't that they were openly hostile to each other, but something in their interactions, something in Laura's eyes, spoke of a deeper discomfort. Perhaps it was my instincts as a nurse, trained to observe even the smallest of changes in people's behaviors, that made me so attentive to these signs. As I stood in the kitchen one Saturday morning, flipping pancakes for breakfast, I called up to Emma, who was getting ready in her room upstairs. Her father, Brian, was already seated at the dining table, newspaper in hand, sipping his coffee. I loved the calmness of the mornings we shared, especially when the day was just beginning, and everything seemed so peaceful. Emma, despite being only 15, was already taller than me, with light brown hair and blue eyes that mirrored her father's. She was excited about her plans to stay over at Lily's. "You have a test today, don't you?" I asked, as I placed a plate of pancakes in front of her. "Yes, biology," Emma replied, pouring maple syrup over her pancakes with the same confidence that she carried through life. "I think I'll get a perfect score." I smiled at her assurance. But deep down, I knew that it wasn't the test that was making my stomach churn. It was the weekend ahead. It was the first time she would be away from us, and I couldn't shake off the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right with Lily's family. "Of course you can have your sleepover this weekend," I said, smiling at my daughter's glowing face when I told her she could stay at Lily's. "Thanks, Mom," she exclaimed, before quickly texting Lily to confirm the plans. The ease with which she handled everything, from her schoolwork to her friendships, made me proud. Yet, my heart couldn't help but worry. As I packed her overnight bag, her pajamas, a change of clothes, and even some regular medication just in case, Brian noticed my hesitation. He could always tell when something was bothering me. "Is something bothering you?" he asked, placing his hand on my shoulder. He had a way of making me feel like everything would be okay, even when I couldn't explain why I felt so uncertain. I shook my head, trying to brush off my worries. "No, I'm just a little concerned. It's her first time staying at someone else's house." Brian, ever the calm one, reassured me. "You're worrying too much. Emma's a responsible girl, and the Harris family has a good reputation. Besides, we've told her to call immediately if anything happens." His logic, so calm and rational, settled some of my nerves. Maybe I was overthinking it. After all, Lily's family had been nothing but kind to us. But there was still a small voice in the back of my mind, telling me that I needed to trust my instincts. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. I finished packing Emma's bag and handed it to her, kissing her on the cheek before she ran out the door to get into Jack's car. Take good care of her, I said, smiling at Jack, who was already behind the wheel. His smile was perfect, too perfect in fact, and I couldn't shake the unease that crept up again. Something about his smile, something about the way he greeted us, felt too rehearsed. Of course, Jack said politely. I'll bring her back tomorrow afternoon. He waved as Emma climbed into the car, and I continued to stand in the doorway, watching as the car turned the corner and disappeared from view. As I returned to the house, Brian was sitting on the couch, flicking through channels on the television. Come on, let's enjoy some time for just the two of us, he said, pulling me down beside him. For the first time in a while, it was just us, and for a moment, I tried to push my anxiety aside and enjoy the quiet. But my mind kept returning to Lily's house, to the strange behavior I had observed in Laura, and to the doubt that gnawed at my insides. Why had I become so worried about something so simple as a sleepover? Perhaps it was because, as a mother, I had learned that sometimes our instincts are the truest compass we have, even when we can't explain them. And as much as I wanted to push away the feeling, I couldn't ignore the fact that something didn't sit right with me. The evening passed by without incident, and for a while, I convinced myself that I was simply being overly protective. Emma's brief message after she arrived at Lily's house reassured me. Movie night. Good night. It seemed like everything was fine. But despite the normality of the situation, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. Around 9:15 p.m., as Brian and I were settling into a quiet evening of wine and a movie, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was Margaret Harris, Lily's mother. The blood drained from my face, and for a split second, I was paralyzed by the anxiety that washed over me. Why was she calling me at this hour? Something in her voice, the urgency, felt wrong. Hello? I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Becky, you need to come get Emma. Margaret's voice trembled. Please, hurry. The words were almost too frantic to make sense of. And in the background, I could hear what sounded like something breaking, followed by a small scream. My heart sank, and panic rose within me. What happened? Is Emma okay? I asked, my voice trembling as I tried to understand the situation. The image of my daughter, alone in that house, filled my mind. Margaret's voice cracked. Please, just come right away. Don't tell anyone, just come quickly. The call ended abruptly, and I stood frozen for a moment, barely able to comprehend what I had just heard. Brian's face had shifted from a relaxed expression to one of concern as he turned to me. What's wrong? Margaret, she called me. I said, struggling to hold back my panic. She said to come get Emma right away. Something's wrong. Without thinking, I grabbed my car keys and rushed out of the house. I barely noticed the cold rain that had begun to fall as I drove through the darkened streets of the neighborhood. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Why had Margaret sounded so frightened? What had happened in that house? When I pulled up to the Harris home, a chill ran down my spine. The large, white colonial-style house, which had always appeared so warm and welcoming in daylight, now looked foreboding in the darkness. The light spilling from the windows only added to the ominous atmosphere. I parked the car quickly and rushed to the front door, which swung open just as I reached it. Margaret stood before me, but she was no longer the well-put-together woman I'd seen at school meetings. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Her long-sleeved blouse was torn at the cuffs, revealing a purple bruise beneath. She grabbed my arm with shaking fingers, and I felt the coldness of her hands. Where's Emma? What's going on? I asked, my voice sharp with concern. Margaret pointed upstairs, but her face looked even more terrified as she clutched my arm tighter. Upstairs, in Caitlin's room. She whispered, please, just look quietly. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something was terribly wrong, and I couldn't explain why. But I felt like I was about to uncover something that had been hidden for far too long. As I followed Margaret into the house, I noticed the silence hanging in the air. The large living room was eerily still, and the faint sound of footsteps above was the only indication of life. We climbed the stairs together, and when we reached the second floor, I saw that there was only one light shining from underneath the door. The silence in the house felt suffocating. And with each step I took, my anxiety grew. I knocked gently on the door, unsure of what I would find. I opened it slightly, and what I saw inside froze me in place. Emma was sitting on the bed, next to Lily, both girls huddled around a laptop. Their faces were tense, and the seriousness of their expressions made my heart race. Emma looked up at me, surprise flashing across her face. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked, clearly startled. Before I could answer, my gaze shifted to the laptop screen. What I saw there made my blood run cold. The video on the screen showed what appeared to be the Harris family living room. With Laura lying on the floor, Jack's voice was shouting at her, though there was no sound. Even without hearing the words, it was clear that this was a violent altercation. The next clip showed Caitlin, trembling against a wall, bruises clearly visible on her arm. I gasped, my mind reeling from the horror that I was witnessing. Emma stepped toward me, her voice filled with determination. "Mom, we've been gathering evidence. Jack has been abusing Caitlin and her mom for a long time. No one believed them, so they had to get proof." I was speechless, trying to process what Emma had just said. My instincts had been right all along. But the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The subtle signs, the tension, the long-sleeved shirts, it all made sense now. This wasn't just a normal family with some issues. This was a family in crisis. One that had been suffering in silence for far too long. Caitlin, usually so quiet and withdrawn, looked up at me with a mixture of fear and strength in her eyes. "I set up the cameras," she whispered. "I borrowed a small camera from my drama teacher. She thought I was interested in filmmaking. But I wasn't. I needed to capture the truth." The weight of her words settled over me. And suddenly, everything fell into place. The tension I had felt when I first met Laura. The way Jack had seemed too perfect to be true. It all made sense now. The girls had done something incredible. Something brave. They had uncovered the truth that no one else could see. And now, they had the proof they needed. But as I stood there, staring at the footage, I knew this was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would change all of their lives forever. As the footage continued to play on the laptop screen, I stood frozen, unable to look away. My mind raced, processing the painful images of Jack Bradley's violence towards his wife, Laura, and his daughter, Caitlin. The room was heavy with tension, and the only sound was the soft clicking of the laptop as Emma closed it. Her face grim. Caitlin had said they had been gathering evidence for a long time. But the fact that it had come to this, an entire family suffering in silence, ignored by those around them, was almost too much to bear. My heart ached for them, for the abuse they had endured in a house that, on the outside, seemed perfect. I turned to Emma, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my words filled with a mixture of confusion and pain. I knew my daughter, and I trusted her, yet I couldn't understand why they had kept this secret for so long. Emma looked at me, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. "We did try, Mom. I went to the school counselor once. But they said it was a family matter. And Caitlin didn't want to tell anyone because she was afraid no one would believe her. She didn't think anyone would listen." I looked over at Caitlin, her head bowed in shame. She was still trembling, but now there was something else in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Strength." "I couldn't tell anyone," Caitlin said, her voice small but steady. "I thought no one would believe me. But we had to get proof. I knew that if we didn't, he'd keep doing it." My heart broke for this girl, so young and already carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. And yet, despite everything she had been through, Caitlin had found the courage to stand up for herself and her mother. I couldn't help but admire her bravery. "We need to get you both out of here," I said firmly, my voice taking on a determined edge. "We'll figure this out, but you're not going to stay here another night. This is no longer just a family issue, it's abuse. And we can't let it continue." As I spoke, I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching from downstairs. Richard was back. The realization hit me like a cold wave. He was coming back to that house, where he had terrorized his family for so long. Margaret's face went pale, and Caitlin let out a small gasp, her grip tightening on Emma's hand. "It's him," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "He's back." I turned to look at the two girls, my heart pounding in my chest. "Pack your things. Now, we're leaving," I said, my voice low and urgent. Caitlin moved quickly, gathering a few essentials, and Emma did the same. I helped them, my mind racing with how we could get out of this house safely. Without Richard realizing what was happening, Margaret, who had been so silent until now, looked at me with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I can't stay here any longer," she said, her voice breaking. "But Richard will never let us go. He'll say we're crazy, that we're imagining things. He's done it before." I could see the fear in her eyes, and it made my resolve even stronger. "You don't have to go through this alone," I told her gently. "We'll protect you. You and Caitlin are safe with us now. But we have to leave. And we have to leave now." As we moved toward the stairs, I could hear Richard's voice downstairs, his tone low and calm but filled with an edge that sent a chill down my spine. "Where are you, Margaret?" he called out, his voice echoing through the quiet house. "Caitlin, come here." The sound of his voice made everyone freeze. It was as if time itself had slowed. I could feel the tension in the air, the fear radiating from Margaret and Caitlin as we prepared to leave the house. I turned to them, looking into their eyes. "Stay close to me," I whispered. "We're almost there." I could feel my own heart racing. But I also felt a fierce protectiveness for these two women who had suffered for so long. They had been through hell. But tonight, it was over. Tonight, they would be free. The footsteps on the stairs grew louder. Richard was coming. "Don't make a sound," I warned them, as we quickly made our way to the door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard the front door creak open. Richard was coming upstairs. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, my heart hammering in my chest. The tension in the room was unbearable. But I knew we couldn't hesitate any longer. We had no time to lose. With one last glance at Margaret and Caitlin, I opened the door, pulling them into the darkness of the night. We had to get out of that house, before it was too late. As we hurried down the steps and out to my car, I could hear Richard's voice in the distance, his words growing more frantic. But it didn't matter. He wouldn't be able to stop us. Not tonight. We had the evidence. We had the truth. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that the nightmare was finally over. As we sped away from the Harris house, the weight of the moment settled over us. The danger was far from over. But for the first time, it felt like we were on the right path. We had the evidence. We had the strength to face what came next. I looked over at Margaret, who was quietly sobbing in the back seat, holding Caitlin's hand. She had spent so many years in fear. But now, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you," Margaret whispered through her tears. "I never thought I'd escape. I never thought anyone would believe us." "You don't need to thank me," I said softly, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "You're not alone anymore. We'll make sure you're safe." When we arrived at my house, I could feel the sense of relief begin to wash over us all. The nightmare that had plagued them was now behind them, and it was time for them to heal. Margaret, Caitlin, and Emma were all home now, safe. Together. It was going to be a long journey. But with love, patience, and support, they would rebuild their lives. 6 months later, we were all gathered in my backyard for a barbecue, celebrating a new beginning. The trees were green again. Flowers bloomed, and Caitlin smiled, no longer a shadow of fear. She had found her voice again, and her strength was inspiring. Margaret, too, had started to heal. Life has a way of surprising us, I thought as I watched them. Even in the darkest times, there is always light ahead. This was just the beginning. The journey wasn't over, but together, we would continue to move forward, stronger than before. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories. Thank you for joining us on this journey.